Andrew is back with us after the recent podcast that got an absolutely fantastic reception. And he has brought Jane into the Zoom
Hello.
chat with us. So, huge thank you for being here this evening on our Royal Family Special, guys.
Thanks for asking us.
Very nice to be here.
And how did you guys end up collaborating?
Well, Jane is an author of mine. So I've known her a long time. We're both members of the Biographers Club. And she's written several books, but a very good book on the Queen's early childhood. So I think a very interesting take.
On the Queen's only childhood. What drew you to that subject matter?
Well, the thing is, Shaun, that there's not really very many books just about her childhood. We all think we know the Queen, and to a degree we do, but there's most of the books that have been written about her are about her reign. So I decided it was time perhaps to look in a little bit more depth at her early years, because I'm always interested as a biographer in what makes people tick, what made them who they are. And so, and Andrew will appreciate this obviously as a biographer himself. So to look at the sort of the factors, the people that made her, I think is really interesting.
I'm going to come back to you on that in a second. So, Andrew, I'm just wondering what has the reception been like to the other videos we've done? Have any people contacted you or anything? Have you had any support come through from those?
Yes, I've had several people contact me with stories about Mountbatten. A woman whose neighbour had served on a ship with him. One woman thought that her mother may have been illegitimate, but since the child with him as the father, but since he was 13 at the time, I thought it was very unlikely. But yeah, it's very interesting stuff, which is always why, appearing on programs and going to festivals, as Jane will testify, is always fascinating to get that, because people will come up and tell you things.
Yeah, it was very well received. And if people haven't seen it yet, it's called Prince Charles's Mentor, Lord Mountbatten, Andrew Lowney. All right, so going back to your book then, Jane, what were the most surprising revelations about the Queen in her youth?
I think one of the things that's often overlooked is the influence that her mother's family had on her, which is the Bowes-Lyons family. And I find them fascinating. I mean, unfortunately, one of them has very recently been in the press for less savoury reasons. But generally speaking, this is the Scottish side of her family. And her grandfather was the Earl of Strathmore, and she spent a lot of time, actually not very far from me, as a child, on her grandparents' estate. They're the ones who owned Glamis Castle as well, that great big edifice in Scotland. And they really were very influential. I mean, her first experience of horses actually was with her grandmother, Granny Strathmore, who kept polo ponies, dogs. And when her parents, who were still the Duke and Duchess of York, went on their 6-month Commonwealth tour, Princess Elizabeth was just 6 months old. And so she was left quite a lot with, actually between two sets of grandparents, between her royal set, George V and Queen Mary, and the Bowes-Lyons. And she spent quite a lot of time on their Hertfordshire estate, getting used to the animals and her eccentric grandfather. And she spent a lot of time with them as she grew up, and including in Scotland. And they had a formative influence on her in many ways. I mean, George V, George VI, as the Duke of York became, always said that they were much more fun than his own family, because, with George V and Queen Mary as your parents, I mean, with the best will in the world, they weren't the most emotionally giving people
Available
that way. Yes. And but whereas the Bowes-Lyons were really a lot of fun, and were always playing silly games, and the Duke of York, the later George VI, said, I wish I could have more of a relaxed family. So it was quite important to him.
Jane, I was going to ask you a question. I've just come across in research on my new book on Edward VIII that they used to go to a place called Pittsford Manor in Northamptonshire a lot, and that's where she used to ride. This was the home of a man called Drummond from Drummond's Bank. Have you come across that? Because one of the suggestions is that Edward VIII, George VI was a godparent of Drummond's son. but that Edward VIII actually had an affair with Drummond's wife, and that Edwina Drummond was his daughter.
The Drummonds do come into it, but slightly earlier, because they the Queen Mother's cousin, as she became the Queen Mother, but when she was marrying George, the future George VI, one of her cousins, her Boselines cousins, was having an illicit affair with somebody he shouldn't have been having an affair with, and a child resulted that the Boselines wanted to have nothing to do with. But the Drummonds were actually involved, not directly, but they were related. One of them was related to one of the judges that heard the case, because this poor girl who was disowned by the Boselines, or rather never owned up to, she was related to one of the judges, the Drummonds. So the Drummonds come into it. I mean, not in such a precise way, but clearly there was a family connection there.
Yeah, because I mean, and used to go and visit. I mean, the other thing I found fascinating about your book was just the whole question of the Queen Mother's parentage, which is sort of still disputed, isn't it? Or not very, it's not very well known, but I think there's some big questions there.
Yes, there are. I mean, and some of them she was, if you like, she raised them herself. In fact, I was visiting the church the other day where she was brought up and where she was christened, and there's a big plaque on the wall saying, you know, that she was born here and so on. But there, yes, you're right, there is a big question mark as to whether she really, well, whether she was born there, and B, whether the Countess was actually her biological mother. There's no question that on the royal side of her descendancy there, and there's no question that the Earl of Strathmore, Claude Boselines, was her biological grandfather. But there is some doubt. And actually, when I was writing my book, in fact, Lady Colin Campbell made some very good points in a book she wrote earlier, and I wanted to try and disprove it. I thought, no, this is a lot of nonsense. You know, I'm sure there's not going to be any doubt. But actually, I can't. I mean, the jury is out, but I can't say definitely that, you know, that she put it this way. It's raised more questions than it's answered the more I've looked at that side of it. Not that that makes any difference to the Queen or her, you know, her own position, because of course the Boselines weren't royalty; they were nobility, very ancient Scottish nobility. But you know, it wouldn't make a huge amount of difference. But it was extraordinary that that these points should be raised. Something else actually was raised with me quite recently, which I'm not at liberty to say anything about, but which casts all sorts of questions a little bit further on the Strathmore situation. But you know, in due course, that.
Oh, tell us. What about the chap who got to prison?
No, I can't until I've done my own. No, I'm going to be true to my source. I'm not going to let down my source, and B, say where I got it from, and. So you'll just have
you can't hint what it's about.
No, I can't. No, I'm going to look into it more first. Yeah.
All right. Tying in then what you said about the Queen, looking at the childhoods of the Queen and Charles, Harry recently criticised the raising of Charles, saying that it was cruel, and it kind of put this dysfunction in the royal family's DNA. What? Both of you then, could you give your impression of whether that is accurate, or whether that was just he was lashing out emotionally, or if there's any basis for that from your research?
Well, I think there's always been a sort of a tension, and the Crown looks at it very well, between public duty and private pleasure. I think, for example, the Queen, put her own responsibilities as the monarch ahead, perhaps, of giving time to her children. That's certainly true of Philip. And I think that one of the reasons Mountbatten was close to Charles was that he had time to, in a sense, be a parent or be a grandparent to Mountbatten in a way, perhaps at that time Philip and the Queen couldn't. But I think we know so little really about what goes on behind the closed doors. We rely on sources, courtiers, or whatever, and we may find that actually it appears Philip was actually a much more liberal and sympathetic figure than perhaps people realized, and perhaps a better parent. And I think from what I gather, the relationship between Philip and Charles got better as time went on. But as Jane alluded, I mean, Queen Mary and King George V were appalling parents, and all their children were damaged really as a result of their coldness, I think.
Yes, I mean, I think first of all, I think Harry was out of order to, well, he keeps thrashing out in ways that are rather unfair, because the royal family, being who they are, they don't respond directly. They, you know, it's all very well for Harry to criticize. I mean, we can all say things about our parents that weren't perfect, but just Harry keeps going on about it. But I think that certainly Charles's childhood, yes, as Andrew said, she's, you know, I think she wasn't a great mother, and I think she loved, you know, I'm sure there was no doubt about her love, but she, in her early days of her marriage, she very much went off and left Prince Charles with his grandparents, George VI and Queen Elizabeth. And there's a very poignant letter that Queen Elizabeth writes to Princess Elizabeth and Philip when they're, I think, in Malta, probably because that's where they tended to go. And she says, oh, it's snowing here, and little Charles, his face is pushed up against the window, and he's watching the snowflakes come down, and he will be so pleased to see you again. And it really, the first time I read that, it really brought a lump to my throat, because I thought, this poor little boy who was not just left for a couple of weeks, but, you know, for substantial amounts of time, for them to go off and not be doing official things, but be doing their own, yeah, as Andrew says, pursuing their own pleasure, which, you know, fair enough. You know, they were newlyweds, not newlyweds, but it was the, you know, relatively early days of marriage. And I think she did put her, first of all, her duty as to her country and to Philip as a wife, before she perhaps turned to the children. But then, you know, I think perhaps Charles was maybe a particularly sensitive boy, because when you get to Princess Anne a couple of years later, she's quite robust, but then she's much more her father's daughter, I think.
But if you think, it's not just the royals. I mean, aristocrats were like that.
Yeah.
I mean, you think even Mountbattens, you know, that, I mean,
yes.
the poignant stories of the children hearing her come up the stairs and come towards the nursery, and her walking past and not coming in, and, you know, sending them away, you know, on a holiday in July and only remembering where they were in November. So I don't think it's unusual in some ways within certain circles.
Yes, I think so. I mean, and because I also look at the aristocracy as well for other books and other research, and dysfunction is not uncommon in the sense of irregularities in relationships and treatment. It makes for a very interesting mix, and often for very interesting people, but not necessarily undamaged ones.
I mean, think of William. He's had the same upbringing. He seems perfectly balanced and seems to have established I would have thought, a pretty conventional and normal relationship with his wife and children. So it may be the people rather than actually the circumstances.
Oh yes, and I mean, let's not forget that you know, that awful scene at Princess Diana's funeral, when the two little princes are following the coffin, and there's, you know, the young Harry, and you know, you can't overestimate or rather can't underestimate the effect that would have on him. And it may be that William has weathered it better. I always feel it's slightly presumptuous of us as individuals to be saying what, you know, what they should or might feel, but yes, I think probably that as different people, they are, you know, dealing with it very differently. Yeah.